Barış Arduç Elçin Sangu's hidden romance finally exposed. There is a photograph, taken at a private gathering in Istanbul, passed between phones before anyone realized what it meant. Two people standing just close enough. Not touching, but close enough that everyone who saw it asked the same question at the same time. How long has this been going on? Because if you know who these two people are, you already understand why that question matters so much. Barış Arduç and Elçin Sangu are not just two Turkish celebrities. They are two of the most recognized, most beloved, most fiercely followed faces in the history of Turkish television. And for years, separately, they had each become symbols of something. He was the brooding, charismatic lead who could make an entire country stop breathing with a single scene. She was the luminous, razor-sharp actress who made every role feel like it was written specifically for her soul. They existed in the same industry, the same world, the same sky. But somehow, they never seemed to orbit each other. Not publicly, not visibly. Until suddenly, they did. And when it happened, it did not trickle out slowly. It detonated. To understand why this story consumed so many people, you have to understand what these two figures meant to their audience before they ever meant anything to each other. Turkish entertainment does not produce celebrities the way other industries do. It produces something closer to cultural fixtures. People who become woven into the everyday fabric of millions of lives through long-running dramas, late-night talk shows, magazine covers, and the slow accumulation of parasocial intimacy that builds over years of watching someone play love, grief, betrayal, and joy in your living room every single week. Barış Arduç had been doing exactly that since his early career breakthrough, when a generation of viewers essentially grew up watching him navigate increasingly complex roles. He had the kind of face that the camera seemed to understand better than most directors did. And he had something rarer than looks or talent. He had specificity, a way of making even the smallest gesture feel considered. Fans did not just watch him. They studied him, analyzed him, argued over what a particular look in his eye during a certain scene actually meant. That level of devotion does not happen by accident. It builds slowly, over years, and it creates a kind of public ownership that celebrities rarely fully reckon with until it costs them something. Elçin Sangu had built something slightly different, but equally powerful. She came up in a moment when Turkish audiences were hungry for a certain kind of female presence on screen. Not passive, not decorative, not simply the beautiful woman standing next to the more complicated man. She brought edge. She brought wit. And she brought a vulnerability that felt earned rather than performed. When she cried on screen, it did not feel like acting. When she laughed, it spread. She became the kind of actress other actresses wanted to be, and the kind of woman a very large audience felt they knew personally, even when they had never met her. So when rumors began quietly circulating in certain corners of Turkish entertainment media that these two were spending time together, the reaction was not simple curiosity. It was something closer to disbelief mixed with a specific kind of hunger. Because people had not seen this coming. And in a world where celebrity relationships are often telegraphed months in advance through careful PR moves and strategically placed paparazzi, the fact that this one had stayed quiet for as long as it apparently had felt like something almost impossible. The first real signal, in retrospect, was easy to miss. There was an industry event in late 2022 where both were present. Nothing unusual about that. Istanbul's entertainment world is not large, and the same names appear at the same events season after season. But people who were there, and who later spoke to entertainment journalists, mentioned something about the way these two existed in the same room. Not overtly. Not in a way that would have made headlines at the time. But there was an awareness between them. A calibrated distance that actually communicated proximity if you knew how to read it. And then there were the phone sightings. Not photographs, not yet. Just accounts from people who claimed to have seen a familiar face in an unfamiliar neighborhood at an unusual hour. Istanbul is enormous, and yet it is also, in certain circles, very small. Two high-profile individuals being spotted near the same residential area twice in 1 month is either coincidence or it is not. The fans who tracked these things, and there were many of them, began to accumulate these small data points with the focus of investigators. What made the situation even more layered was that both Barış and Elçin had visible relationship histories that their audiences felt deeply invested in. He had been linked to other public figures. She had been in a well-documented relationship that had ended publicly enough to generate its own wave of media coverage and fan sympathy. Neither of them had emerged from those chapters without the kind of scrutiny that comes when millions of people feel entitled to your emotional life simply because you allowed them into it through a screen. That history mattered because it meant that any new development would not be evaluated in a vacuum. It would be measured against everything that came before. And the weight of that comparison would either make the story feel earned, or it would make it feel impossible. The photograph changed everything. It is worth being precise here, because the details matter. The image that first began circulating was not taken by a professional. It was grainy in the way that images taken on a phone inside a dimly lit private space tend to be. It showed two people in a moment that was clearly not intended for public consumption. They were not posing. They were not performing. They were simply existing in the same space in a way that communicated something, even without a caption, even without context. The image moved through private messaging groups before it reached public platforms. By the time it appeared on the accounts that Turkish entertainment media monitors closely, it had already been shared thousands of times in circles that most journalists do not have access to. This is how celebrity news now moves in Turkey. Not through tabloids or press releases, but through layered networks of insiders, fans, and social media accounts that operate in a semi-private gray zone between rumor and documentation. The response was not uniform. There were fans who celebrated immediately, flooding comment sections with the particular kind of joy that comes from feeling like something you had suspected or hoped for had finally been confirmed. There were others who were skeptical, pointing out that the image proved proximity, but not necessarily what everyone was inferring from it. And there were some, particularly those who had deep emotional attachments to either Barış or Elçin's previous relationships or public personas, who responded with something that looked a lot like grief. That grief is worth pausing on, because it reveals something honest about what celebrity culture actually costs the people who participate in it. When you spend years watching someone be one thing, when you have built a version of them in your mind that feels real because it has been constructed from thousands of hours of footage and interviews and social media posts, learning that there is a dimension of their life that has been entirely hidden from you can feel like a small betrayal. Not a rational one, but a real one nonetheless. What neither camp fully accounted for yet was how little either Barış or Elçin had actually confirmed. Because in the days following the image's spread, neither of them said anything. No statement. No post. No appearance designed to manage the narrative. Just silence, which in the attention economy is itself a form of communication. Industry insiders who were asked about it by entertainment journalists gave carefully worded responses that did not confirm and did not deny. People close to both of them described the situation as private and asked that it be treated accordingly. Which, of course, it was not. Turkish entertainment media has particular rhythms and particular rules, and one of those rules is that silence from a celebrity on a story of this magnitude is understood as implicit confirmation that there is something to confirm. Whether that convention is fair is a separate question. But it is the reality of how these stories unfold in that ecosystem. And so, in the absence of denial, the coverage continued and expanded. Slowly, pieces began to connect. Journalists who had been watching both of their social media accounts with the attention of cryptographers pointed out that they had, on multiple occasions over the preceding months, posted from locations that were geographically consistent with one another, within time frames that were logistically suggestive. This was not conclusive, but it was the kind of circumstantial accumulation that, when enough of it builds up, starts to feel like a pattern rather than coincidence. There was also the question of their mutual professional connections. People who worked with both of them, separately, on different projects, began to be asked pointed questions by reporters. Most declined to comment. But the ones who did offer anything, even obliquely, tended to confirm the same thing. That both Barış and Elçin, over the past several months, had seemed different. Lighter, in some indefinable way. More settled. The kind of quality that people who know someone well can identify even when they cannot fully articulate it. Then came the second photograph. This one was different, clearer, taken outdoors in daylight, in a context that suggested neither person had been expecting to be photographed. They were walking, side by side, not dramatically close, but close enough. And this time, there was an expression on both faces that was harder to argue with. Not happiness performed for a camera. Something quieter. Something that looked very much like the ordinary comfort of two people who have grown used to being near each other. It ran in several outlets before the end of the week. The response dwarfed what the first image had generated. By this point, both of their names were trending on Turkish social media simultaneously, something that had never happened before in quite this way. International fan accounts that followed Turkish drama were translating and sharing the coverage. Entertainment journalists who had been cautiously hedging their language dropped the qualifications and began reporting the relationship as an established fact. And still, neither Barış nor Elçin had said a word. What they did instead was something that, in retrospect, communicated more clearly than any statement could have. They simply continued living their lives. They attended separate professional events, gave interviews focused on their work, and declined every invitation to address the personal narrative that was consuming their public profiles. This was not the behavior of two people trying to escape a story. It was the behavior of two people who had decided, together, that the story was not theirs to tell on anyone else's schedule. That decision, in an industry where the pressure to manage public perception is immense and constant, was itself a kind of statement. It said something about who they were individually, and perhaps something about who they were together. The moment that finally moved the story from speculation into something more definitive came not from a photograph or a leaked account, but from a public appearance. There is a specific kind of courage involved in being seen somewhere together when you know that being seen is the confirmation. Not a press conference, not a red carpet, not a managed moment. Just appearing in a shared context without apology. Those who were present described the atmosphere as deliberate in its casualness. Two people who were clearly aware of the weight of the moment and had chosen not to perform either discomfort or defiance in response to it. Just presence. Just themselves. The coverage that followed was extensive. But something interesting had shifted in its tone. Because by this point, weeks of silence had actually done something unexpected. It had generated respect. The fan communities that had initially fragmented into celebration and skepticism and grief had, by and large, arrived at something more unified. An acknowledgement that these were two adults who had handled an impossible situation with more dignity than most people in their position manage. Commentary from entertainment journalists reflected this. Pieces that had begun as breathless coverage of a celebrity revelation started to include language about privacy, about the particular cruelty of a culture that demands emotional transparency from public figures while offering nothing in return. About whether the hunger for this kind of story serves anyone except the outlets that profit from it. That is the conversation this story actually opened, underneath all the photographs and trending topics and fan theories. Because Barış Arduç and Elçin Sangu are not the first public figures to attempt to keep a significant relationship private, and they will not be the last. But the specific way in which their story unfolded, the photograph, the silence, the slow accumulation of evidence, the dignity of the response, and then the quiet confirmation, mapped something real about the tension between a celebrity's obligation to their audience and their right to a self that belongs to no one but them. There is an argument, one that some of their more thoughtful fans have made, that the privacy they protected was not just for their own sake. That there is something valuable in being shown that two people can be public figures without being public property. That the hunger to know everything about someone is not the same as caring about them. And that the refusal to feed that hunger is not a betrayal of the people who have invested emotionally in your career. It is, in fact, a form of respect. A drawing of a line that says, I give you my work. I give you my performances. I give you the parts of myself that are meant to be given. But this part is mine. Whether that argument lands differently depending on how deeply you were invested in either of them before this story broke probably tells you something true about where you personally sit in the ongoing negotiation between celebrity culture and human dignity. What is not in dispute is that both of them emerged from this particular chapter having lost nothing essential. Their reputations remained intact. Their professional standing was unaffected. And what little both of them have communicated publicly since, in the careful, limited way they have chosen to engage with the subject at all, has reflected two people who appear genuinely happy. Not performing happiness for an audience. Actually living it, even if living it requires drawing a curtain around most of it. The photograph that started all of this is still out there. The coverage still circulates. Fans still analyze it. Journalists still write about what it means and what comes next. But what stays with you, if you let it, is not the photograph itself. It is the silence that followed it. And what that silence chose to protect. What do you think? Let us know in the comments.